We published a 10th anniversary edition of Race for Relevance because we could see that the 6 challenges facing associations and the 5 strategies that we suggested as a result were continuing to erode association market share and to challenge association board and staff in remaining relevant in a rapidly changing environment. We agreed to write the book prior to the pandemic, and it became even more important post-pandemic as all of the trends and challenges accelerated as a result of the pandemic. One of the things that Harrison and I heard after the first edition came out is that it was like we had been in their boardroom. And I think that came from the fact that we had facilitated so many strategic planning retreats and had heard the themes repeated over and over. We know of some book clubs that are forming around the book already, and I'm excited about that because I think it creates a safe way to start a necessary conversation about the future of associations. If I was an association CEO, I would be focused on 2 things right now. One, I would be focused on building an innovative culture within my board and my staff, because I just think that is so very important. And when we look at the associations that are thriving and not just surviving, they have this in place. And the second thing that I would be focused on is having a conversation about risk tolerance. One of the things that concerned me, quite honestly, in the pandemic was the number of associations who saw it as a badge of honor that they didn't have to dip into their reserves. We have been saving these reserves for years and years and years and years for a rainy day. And the pandemic was not just a rainy day, it was a tsunami. And yet, in many cases, we chose to hoard those reserves instead of use them strategically to help not just keep the association in place, but to strengthen it so that it would be better, more relevant, and have a stronger value proposition on the other side of it. So I absolutely think we need to be talking about both risk tolerance and our reserve strategy.
One thing I would be focused on as a CEO would be ensuring that we had, our association had a very intentional approach to composing our boards. I think that one of the things we say in the book is that one of the most important changes to make is getting your board right. Because if your board isn't composed for performance, you're not gonna perform. Associations can't outperform their boards anymore. The environment's too challenging. And so a lot of times I ask execs, what if you could put together your dream team of a board that you could go back and, let's say you've been a CEO for 10 or 15 years and you've got 15 years of boards and officers, and you could go back and select 5 from all those people that would really put together the kind of team that you need to affect change and to improve the organization's value and relevance. So I really think that it's time well spent, and it's going to pay big dividends if we get our boards right.
Harrison, I'd add to that, the board is extremely important, but so is staff. And we've both heard from the CEOs that we work with that some of the staff skill sets they have now are not necessarily the staff skill sets they need going forward. So I would add that it's not just composing the volunteer leadership team that's important, but it's also composing a very, very strong internal staff team as well. Probably the biggest one is going to be the question about in-person versus virtual delivery. I was just on a call this morning with an association executive who said they were struggling before the pandemic, but now even more so because engagement is even more difficult. I think instead of an either or strategy, either we're going to be in person or we're going to be virtual, I think we need to embrace an and strategy. What we have seen is that virtual has allowed us to reach more people more easily. we have seen examples of associations who traditionally got 1,200 members at their annual meeting, and this year they had 8,500 at their annual meeting. Now, it remains to be seen if this kind of virtual participation is going to continue or if it was directly related to the pandemic or not. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is the whole role of innovation in associations. We have seen how resilient we are and how innovative we are under pressure. But going forward, we need to have an innovative culture. And this is an area that the foundation has done quite a bit of research around. And it's worth digging into and taking a look at, learning what the more innovative cultures have, because if these are in place, it's much easier to move forward to change the future of the organization and to capitalize on what we've seen over the last couple of years. So I believe the in-person piece of it, innovation, and then a third question really is the global question. We've seen how we are connected globally more than ever, but as various parts of the world recover more quickly, which is one of the drivers, or one of the pieces, excuse me, covered in the world shaped by COVID driver that Foresight Works has. As we've seen different recovery paces, that is going to affect where we have our meetings, how we have our meetings, and frankly, who is going to be interested in being a part of our association and able to travel to participate in our associations. So those are the few that come to mind right off the top of my head.
And Mary, the one thing I would add to that is the whole work from home issue and how that will impact the office and facility needs of associations going forward. I think a lot of the times we think about our members working from home, but our association staffs are also have been working from home. And I think there's an expectation that association staff will want the flexibility to do that in the future. And so it begs the question about what kind of headquarters space that we're going to need going forward.
And Harrison, that adds to one of the things that we talk a lot about in Race for Relevance, and that is where the money is going to come from for a digital transformation. We already know of associations who have either sold their building or in the process of selling their building, or that will be negotiating a smaller lease footprint for their association staff. And we believe that is an area where organizations who need to accelerate their digital transformation can actually find funding to do so.
You know, trying to identify the one most significant change driver for associations is challenging, but I would have to say that all things digital. And this is consistent with the ASA's Foundation's research with their Foresight Works, the thematic area of data and technology, one of the 6. But if anything, the pandemic showed us, it demonstrated the potential of technology. Even though we were forced to use it, it still was a significant lesson from the pandemic.
One of the things that we noticed is that those associations who had already been moving to a more digital first mindset had a much easier time transitioning at the beginning of the pandemic because they were already on the move. Those who had been a little slow were challenged in a different way. They needed to make decisions. They had to make them quickly. And they, of course, had a sense of urgency that was working in their favor, but they lacked the time necessary to develop a phased long-term strategy, and instead had to pivot on very, very short notice, which not only was stressful, but in some cases made it more difficult for them to have a more methodical plan in place.
You know, I think one of the biggest lessons learned by association executives in the pandemic, although they may not recognize it, is that we learned that we could pretty much run our associations off of our mobile phones if we had to. And that's a very striking revelation if you think about it. Now, of course, it wasn't perfect and it had a lot of downsides associated with it. But we need to take that experience to say to ourselves, look what we were able to do when we were forced to. Now, in an environment where it's not mandated, how do we capitalize on the the potential of technology to deliver education, to network, to educate, etc.
We also learned how quickly we can pivot when necessary and needed. Very stressful, yes. A lot of uncertainty, definitely. But one of the things we know about innovation is that it requires us to dance with uncertainty. I think it would be a travesty if we worked super hard to go back to normal rather than developing a go forward strategy that harnesses what we've learned, that change is doable, that our boards will give us permission to go along and help us find the funding that we need to be able to be a different association going forward. My biggest fear and the thing that I'm hearing is that the return and the desire to go back to what we know, to our tradition, to what's comfortable. And it would be a lost opportunity if we were to do that. I absolutely believe we need to be having conversations around our go forward strategy, not ditching everything that helped us get to today, but certainly embracing some of what we have learned, some of what we have done, and some of what we have experimented over the past 18 months so that we can take that forward with us into the future.
You know, I agree 100%, Mary. And to say it in another way, I think that association executives and their volunteer leadership did things that they didn't think they could do during the pandemic. And so that experience should embolden them to be more aggressive in capitalizing on innovation and change in their operations.
We've talked about strengths and the things that we've learned, but I also think the pandemic has shown us where some of our weaknesses are. We've mentioned the digital first mindset and having a strong digital underpinning so that we can take the association to members wherever they are, whenever they want to access it. But for some organizations, this is a weakness. The additional area that I think is a weakness for some organizations is in the governance area. In many cases, we haven't been as intentional and deliberate as we've needed to be to recruit carefully so that we have strong visionaries in the boardroom, strong technology advocates in the boardroom, and individuals who aren't as concerned about protecting the association today as they are about being stewards and thinking about 10 years down the road. What are the actions that we need to take? What are the decisions that we need to make in order to be a strong, vibrant association going forward? I was just talking with a client over the weekend about this, and they are starting a chapter of the Future initiative, knowing that it's going to take them many, many years to get where they need to be. They realize they need to have the right advocates in the boardroom for this conversation, and frankly, in some of their other leadership positions as well.
When you look at composing a board and being intentional about it, I think that there are two questions that you want to ask yourself. The first one is, over the next couple of years, what is going to be what are the biggest opportunities going to be for the association? And number two, what are the challenges going to be? And what kind of board members can help us capitalize on those opportunities or to deal with those challenges? And I'll give you an example of one area that qualifies in both, and that would be diversity, inclusion, and equity. The fact that it's an opportunity because the population of the United States is radically changing, and our memberships are more diverse, and we have got to be effective at dealing with diversity and inclusion. But it's also a challenge because traditionally we haven't really been as effective at that as I think we might have been. So there's an example, but it goes back to the fundamental question. If we just say, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What kind of board members are going to help us deal with those challenges or capitalize on those opportunities?
We know that having a diversity of voices in the boardroom, on committees, on task forces, strengthens decisions that are made for associations. The foundation did some excellent research around this and published Recruit the Right Board by Mark Engel and Will Brown. And for those looking for research-based suggestions, ideas, and even some templates on how to be more intentional and deliberate and to make sure they have diversity reflected in their leadership, that is a resource that I highly recommend. I think the most critical thing we've seen to affecting change in this type of challenging environment is a willingness to talk about possibilities. We know that any kind of change starts with a conversation. And often we feel too threatened to even have the conversation. And I know that Harrison and I have both seen this in our work as consultants. If there's no conversation started, no change is going to occur. So we believe that flexibility and open-mindedness are two key characteristics of the preferred board member of the future. And that doesn't mean just because you have a conversation that change is going to happen. It means that you are strong enough and brave enough and courageous enough to at least be willing to talk about what should or what might need to change.
You know, when you look at leadership characteristics in affecting change, uh, some of them are more pronounced than others. But one of the areas that I think we underplay is the role of stamina in leadership. I can give you a couple of examples. One in a governance initiative where a doctor in a medical society was able to sustain a year and a half effort to make some major, significant changes in their governance. And it just took a tremendous amount of effort and the stamina to sustain that effort.
We know that a lot of leaders are going to be retiring because of the pandemic. And I've talked to some who've said, I know that I could take my association the next 5 to 10 years, but I'm not sure I want to. And I've had others tell me, honestly, they're just not sure they have what it takes. So we have a new group of association leaders coming in, and I believe that Race for Relevance gives them some language to talk to their leaders about the challenges facing them today. There is research that will benefit them in terms of statistics around digital spending, what you might be looking at, ways to compose your board for performance going forward. So some of the solutions, maybe not perfectly for their organization, because we understand that all have their own unique history, culture, and traditions, but there are suggestions and there are strategies within the book that can shore up and strengthen an association going forward. And we have seen this over and over and over. We've had association professionals who have talked about how they've used the programs and service evaluation matrix, how they've redone their governance, how they're redoing their digital technology, and the results they're getting are impressive. We wrote the book, but even we are impressed by what we are seeing associations do as a result of new strategy and fresh thinking.
You were able to do things that you didn't think you could do. And now that you have had that experience and learned that you could overcome a lot of the impediments or barriers that you had recognized, that you're emboldened now to have a stronger appetite for change and innovation in your organization. And the other thing is that this pandemic kind of gives you a kind of a clean break as we come out of it. And so it gives you an opportunity to take on initiatives or innovations that you maybe had considered, but now it gives you an opening or a time where you can introduce them. And on the other hand, it also gives you an opportunity to discontinue or sunset programs and activities that have outlived their usefulness or no longer deliver value.
My advice would be, don't waste this opportunity. There has been a huge loss of life. It's been a huge amount of stress. It's been truly a once in a century and maybe even a once in a lifetime moment when the entire world has been affected by something simultaneously. Let's harness that and don't look forward to going back, but instead create a proactive go forward strategy, because the associations that are going to win the race for relevance are the ones that are going to purposely design a future that will enable them to thrive, not just survive.